All right, welcome to today's LinkedIn Live brought to you by Optiv. I'm Tiffany Shogren, Director of Cybersecurity Education here at Optiv, and with me today is Lena Davitt, Executive Director for Office of the CISO for Optiv Canada. This week marks Data Privacy Week, a reminder that privacy is no longer just regulatory compliance, but it's now a business critical function. As organizations use more data than ever before, expectations around how that data is collected, used, and stored have also evolved. In today's conversation, Lena and I will focus on why privacy matters, what you should prioritize, and the role of awareness and education in navigating that privacy landscape. Now, I've been on a number of these live events, and the audience can make all the difference. So we want to hear from you. If you have questions or comments for our discussion today, drop them in the chat at any time. Specifically, though, we're going to have quite a few business leaders, security practitioners on the line. From your perspective, what is the biggest challenge today in maintaining transparency and control over how data is used? So again, what's your biggest challenge today when it comes to data? So Lena, to get us started while we're waiting for those responses to come in, I have a question for you. A lot of organizations still anchor their privacy programs around this annual regulatory compliance initiative, right? So from a CISO perspective, why is compliance no longer enough of a driver for these programs?
Well, that's a great question to get us started, Tiffany. And I think we've got to the point where privacy risk is a business risk. You can't think of it in any other way. Your stakeholders expect clear privacy outcomes in how you're collecting, using, and storing their data. And I think, traditionally people think of it as, beyond and this is beyond the risks of things like your financial risks, your regulatory, legal risks, litigation, class actions, your risks to your operations. I really want to sort of take it back to look at your reputational risks and sort of the trickle effect of what reputational harm can be done. There's some stuff, and you see it now. And I will say, we even, 10, 15 years ago, someone would ask for a phone number, an email, you would give it without really thinking about where all this is going. But, you see now this move by a lot of people, just consumers, your public, your clients, they're really focusing on, I don't know that I want to give you this, because you look at sectors like healthcare, sectors where sensitive data is stored. What happens to that risk? I mean, I hate to say it's almost like a daily occurrence when you're seeing how this data, you have these massive breaches and people's sensitive data is gone, and people are understanding and starting to realize just how dangerous that can be. One of the other things to look at is how far regulations fall behind technology threats and data use. Things are moving so rapidly. Even think about where we were even 2 years ago. Right. So anything that sort of gets implemented, it's almost like trying to create regulations around something that's going to happen 2 years from now. You may not be able to see what's going to happen clearly 2 years from now. So how are you preparing, and how can you just focus on that as a way forward? And look at the average that it takes to sort of develop, implement new regulations. It's like a multi-year project. So we don't live in an age where that's good enough anymore, unfortunately. One of the other ways I want you to think about it is how compliance establishes a baseline and not transparency and trust. And so I love analogies, not going to lie. This goes back to my investigative interviewing days where you're trying to convey ideas. So I apologize in advance if I'm going to use a lot of analogies, but they really do, I think, really spell it out. So one of the things to think about it like a driver's license, right? So if you have a driver's license, it shows that you are legally allowed to drive on the roads. That is the minimum. So think of compliance like that. That is your minimum. You're allowed to drive on the road. But that doesn't tell you, having a driver's license doesn't mean you're a good driver, doesn't mean you're a safe driver, doesn't mean you haven't caused multiple accidents, you haven't hurt people, you haven't broken the rules that exist. And so, and I want to look at it in that way, because it is your baseline, but it's your minimum. So when you look at trust, on the other hand, trust is about showing you can handle more, because really compliance shows that you've met the rules, you've met that minimum requirement. But really, trust is showing that you can handle risks that are coming, maybe haven't been realized yet. And then lastly, I think So anyone who's ever heard me speak or knows anything about me knows I hate checkboxes. Don't just checkbox something. It's disingenuous. It really does it really matter in the big scheme of things? When it's, in the midst of a crisis, a checkbox isn't going to save you. So security leaders really do need to focus and shift their privacy training from a regulatory mindset more to aligning sort of security awareness with real world scenarios and what that means.
Yeah, so I resonate a lot with your driver's license analogy. My stepdaughter Sophie is 17, and yes, she has a driver's license. She knows the rules of the road. That does not necessarily mean that she has the ability to handle the nuance of driving on the snow and the ice, right? We all just had this big snowstorm. And that comes from, in an organization, it comes from like having a culture of awareness, right? If I were to have a test for Sophie on the rules of the road, not only would she tune out and not want to participate in that, but the if this then that doesn't always occur that way, right? And so I agree with you wholeheartedly on like the real world scenarios within that training, but just making sure that it is a whole culture and not just, as you said, the check the box.
Yeah, 100%. No, and that's exactly it. And I think just understanding what that looks like in total. Actually, funny you said that about, so fun fact, I'm going to veer off for a second, but when my daughter was learning to drive, I remember one of the first instances, she had her license and she was practicing, but it was so terrible for me that my Fitbit thought that I'd gone for a run. So yes, the cybersecurity and security and, sort of data protection, it can feel the same way. So I totally get that. No, Tiffany, this is a great sort of segue into talking about how privacy becomes more connected to business risk. So in your mind, should organizations approach cyber? How should organizations approach it? What are they doing? How are they looking at it? How are they talking about education and awareness for their teams and for their organizations?
Yeah, the ones that are doing it well are making it stick, right? And they're doing so by making it more meaningful, translating the regulations, as you said, that take years and years and years to come to fruition. And then we give people a 30-minute training and expect them to understand all of that. Putting that legal jargon in front of them isn't going to make it meaningful. So translating it into that day-to-day is going to help build the culture. I think the other thing that organizations do really well is role-based approaches to it. So, you have users with privileged access that have access to different data, different systems, and making sure that we're addressing or those organizations are addressing how their day-to-day looks different than other end users, right? Because if we're speaking down to a privileged access user, again, they're going to tune out, and you miss that opportunity to make it meaningful for them and to the business. I think the awareness piece of it can help reduce accidental misuse of data.
Yeah.
But it's really the culture of your organization that reinforces the controls in place. Being able to articulate, here are the rules versus here is how I abide by the rules within these controls. That's the culture piece of it. We talk a lot about AI literacy. There's privacy literacy as well.
Yes.
And being able to understand that and how it connects to business risk is really important. And I think that goes hand in hand with increasing awareness.
No, 100%. And I so love that you keep talking about culture. That's a particularly important one that a lot of people don't really put I don't want to say the effort into. They don't really view it as a line of defense. They view it as something that has to be done. And we talk about checkboxes again, and you're talking about these checkboxes. But you're absolutely right. Having that culture where we'll help you reduce things like, incidents where people are misunderstanding. Let's face it, majority of your employees are not malicious, they're not negligent, they're not harmful. They just maybe don't understand. Like they're not doing something to hurt the organization. All they're trying to do is do their job. But whether it's from a misunderstanding, a negligent action, or malicious action, the end result is still the same. The end result is still harm to the organization. So how do you prevent that? How do you work on that? Like, do your employees, do your teams know what they're supposed to do, what they're supposed to retain, why they are doing it? And when you think of it from a privacy literate teams, they do make better decisions. They need to have that understanding all around. To me, this is especially important because I'm a huge believer in cross training your teams. And I'm not saying make, the people on this team an expert on, a totally different role, but people have to understand what other teams do, what other roles encompass. And because decisions shouldn't be made in silos. And the problem is when you have a team that's like, well, nope, we are just in charge of privacy, everyone else can do something else. But if you don't cross train, number one, you're missing opportunities to decrease redundancy, but you're also missing opportunities to help safeguard, because the higher the silos are, the bigger the gaps in between them. And people really do need to understand that the impact of that. So no, I love it. And I think, so to me, we're going to jump right into AI, if that's okay, Tiffany, because how do we jump into AI? I don't think it's like pumpkin spice everything in the fall. It is everywhere. I think there is a single talk that I have done that someone's like, tell me about AI and where the risks are. But it really is changing privacy and how data moves across organizations. And in your mind, in your role, which is so key to having that, building that positive culture, what role does awareness and education play in preventing data leaks?
I think as with any technology, the thing that we can't do is forget about the people.
Yes.
Data is one of we've all heard it, right? Data is the most valuable, also the most vulnerable asset that we have. And people are your first and last line of defense, right? And, I mentioned AI literacy a moment ago. I think that is similar in privacy, the first step to being able to explain the concepts, explain the importance, explain the place that privacy has within your organization. And I think AI literacy, you have to talk about the privacy elements of that. To a novice AI user, training an LLM, they're like, what does that mean? And understanding that the privacy of the data that you have and what impact that has if it is used to train someone else's LLM, right? And we've talked a little bit about what people should do and what people can't do, right? All of these controls and guardrails. I think one of the things that is missing from privacy training, security awareness training, AI training in general is the empowerment of what you can do, right? Those use cases of this is how we use AI securely, and what we get from that data that we've input in, or what we do with the data that we get out of it, and how we secure that. Again, to bring up kiddos, I met my stepson about 3 years ago, and he is autistic and functionally nonverbal. So he can speak and says words and things, but he's more of a Gestalt language processor, so speaks in scripts. And those scripts come from movies, childhood movies. And as someone who doesn't have my own kiddos that didn't grow up through watching all of those movies, I don't know the scripts, right? Like I don't, the number of times I asked the question, what did he say? What is he talking about? Right. I didn't know, but that was when generative AI was really coming on strong in kind of the commercial market. And I started looking at things differently as we were talking more and more about it at work. And I thought, these scripts are data points. Let me see if I can build an agent that scours, databases of scripts and movie quotes and things like that, and then helps me understand what he's trying to say,
Yeah.
what his mood is, so I started being able to empower myself through that tool, right? And then when I shared about it, people were like, "Oh, but that the data privacy, like, but we can't talk about our clients. When I'm talking to a therapist, can't
Yeah.
talk about our clients or kids." And I'm like, "Okay, so let's talk about non-identifiers. Let's talk about, the anonymization of data that goes in." So, like, just educating them on privacy when using AI and how empowering it can be
Yeah.
to just day-to-day life, in work and at home. And I think drawing that connection is really what, again, makes it meaningful, again, drives culture and really secures organizations.
Yeah, no, 100, that's a great way to look at it because a lot of organizations understand, like they have to be able to move. The problem is, like in my role, I speak to multiple clients right across the country, and I speak to some who are saying, okay, well, we know we need to have, the ability to let our employees, utilize tools, but until we have a, build that governance model, no one's allowed to use anything. Well, but you're also need to recognize, yes, 100%, you need to have rules of engagement, but it also, the world is moving so quickly. And
Mhm,
so recognizing that your employees are likely using it anyway. And, I had one that said, no, no, we don't really need anything AI in our space.
mhm,
It's not going to help with anything. So we're just going to, no one's allowed to use any tools at all. Like it was like a complete lockdown. And I thought, well, that's, you're like almost inviting risk at that point. And so, so of course, being me and being nosy and really just needing to understand, is this actually accurate? I went and I spoke to those employees who said, oh yeah, well, we're not allowed to use anything, any tools on our work devices. So when we have a question we want to ask, we just put it into our personal devices because it helps give us the answer. So now, again, so now you talk about the risks. Do these employees understand what that means and what that looks like? And a lot of employees don't understand how AI tools use those inputs or use their inputs.
mhm.
They don't understand how sensitive data is collected, stored, shared. Do they understand what that means for intellectual property, especially, and how to safeguard that? So there was one, there've been numerous studies, and all the numbers are fairly similar, but around 40% of data professionals use unapproved AI tools at work. And that's data professionals. So what does that mean for your employees that maybe aren't as literate, as privacy literate, or, in that space? What are they doing? How are they using it? And of those employees in this one study that I was reviewing a couple of weeks ago, 1 in 6 of those data professionals are using tools that are free and publicly available. So
Mhm.
what do they recognize the risks there when you look at what goes in there is being used to train? And I I really love the point that you made about teaching your employees of what they can do. That is such a significant part of it. Because if you do empower your employees, recognizing that they will use them, they will find a way to sort of implement it because they want to do their job. They want to
Yep.
do their job well. So, how do you help your employees? How do you help your teams become better at it? Providing training and awareness in how to use it. So it's almost like focusing on what you can do as opposed to what you can't do.
Mhm.
Huge, huge in that. I love that. But also when you're doing that, the benefits aren't just to the employees, they're also for your organization because they're going to help prevent accidental leaks. They're going to help prevent malicious leaks. They're going to help protect your sensitive data and your intellectual property as a whole. So, no, absolutely bang on, Tiffany.
I would also say it increases innovation. If we're speaking specifically
Yes.
about the AI piece, right? Like
Yes.
empowering them to use it securely can
Yeah.
propel the organization forward, right? And
Yeah.
so there's a lot of benefit in creating that culture, but it does take work and it
Yes.
does take planning and thinking outside the box, because to your point, everything is moving so quickly. And the way that we consume information, which is the way that we learn, is also evolving, and we've got to keep up with that. So,
Yeah.
we talked a little bit about the risks. Are there opportunities where AI can strengthen privacy and trust with our clients, our patients, our customers, our employees when implemented securely?
Yeah, absolutely. You look at the benefits. I'm going to give you a prime example of my life pre-Optiv, when I was the commander of the cybercrime team in Toronto for the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. So again, you have to appreciate I didn't grow up in tech space. I would almost say I was the one who, when I would call in the help desk, they'd be like, "Oh my God, somebody call Block Lena because she's calling again." So it was a huge learning curve for me to really immerse myself in this space. But recognizing the potential and the opportunities have been tremendous. So I will say, when you look at how automation improves data classification, and it does this obviously without a whole lot of human effort. It's going to reduce errors. It's going to increase your speed and efficiency. So going back to my policing example, so in Canada, we have disclosure rules around criminal investigations. So you have to disclose everything that you collect, and all our Canadian viewers would understand this. So all information that you collect from the policing side through the investigation gets turned over, but it has to be done and turned over in a meaningful way. So you can't just be like, okay, here's everything. It's not collated. It's not, it's not sourced out. It's not tabbed. And so you have to be able to do that. So now I started off old school. So I started off, doing major investigations in the 90s with an old banker box, and that's what you did. You had a banker box with your files and your tabs of all your things, especially on like homicides and major investigations. But that was back then. So my team had done a takedown that if you look at the data that we collected, because again, cybercrime investigations, they are significant and there is a lot of data. If we had printed off and put everything back in the old school banker boxes, because that's how my brain works, that investigation, one part of it alone, would have been 720,000 banker boxes. Right?
Whoa.
Yeah, which is crazy, right? I can't even fathom that. Like this is why I put it into banker boxes, because again, that was how you knew how serious an investigation was.
Yep.
Now, when you look at that was one investigation. At any given time, my team could be running 3 or 4 of them. So we had one investigation in particular that was very complex. And as a result, there was different components of it. From one part of this investigation, we collected 8 terabytes of data, which again would have been like that is a very significant amount of data. And what happened, because you have a timeline. So to add to the fun of disclosure, you also have 18 months from the moment you charge someone till you get through the court system in Canada. And so you can't just take your time to prevent or provide this information. So we had to basically go through all the information in a very quick timeline. I had to put teams, and again, as the commander, I'm in charge of a budget, which as challenging as that can be in private sector, let me tell you, in public sector, it is a whole nother level of really being, having your guardrails up. And so I had to put teams 7 days a week, multiple shifts through the days for several weeks in order just to get through this one part of this investigation. And as you can imagine, that cost a lot of money. And then, are there errors? Was some of the data classified, incorrectly? How was it vetted? The next go around, when we did a major investigation, we were actually able to advance our team's need to be able to automate what we did. And we were able to automate, we were able to implement an automation process that took us a fraction of the time with barely any resources, because we had the right resources in place. The difference dollar-wise alone was significant, and that's just in one investigation. But it's also the amount of resources that had to draw in, because if I had everybody sitting in there going through these mundane tasks, it was then they can't be used to do other things. They're not going out to do surveillance. They're not going through the evidence. They're not going through information. They're not building, their warrants and their plans. So I look at it in that sense, and I think of what a lifesaver it was and how it can be used so positively. The other thing I think also to think about is how ethical personalization can coexist with privacy in mind. So again, when you look at human error, if you are using your tools effectively when you're looking at implementing processes, you can actually detect sensitive content and enforce policy-based controls automatically. So you're not making those mistakes. So, again, like looking at it from a police investigation standpoint, you have a lot of sensitive data in there, a lot of sensitive information about witnesses, about victims. If you sort of establish, this sort of personalization or processes in place, you can do that without worrying that something inadvertently slips through the cracks. Because I've been, in decades of policing, I've seen it happen where something gets inadvertently released. And so you're able to sort of really tamp down on that. Another thing I think to think about too is how privacy-driven transparency does build your credibility. It builds your trust. It leads, if you lead with a privacy first mindset, people see that. It comes off as genuine, especially in an era where large breaches of sensitive data have become commonplace, unfortunately, and this is happening. But if you aren't adding privacy as an afterthought, if you were leading with it from the front, that is going to come off in everything you do. Also, when you're looking at things like establishing clear ownership, across teams, how AI uses personal data to your teams, like what are the rules of engagement? Does everyone understand what those rules are? And lastly, I think just to wrap up my point on this is how governance, and it was a point you made earlier too, is how governance enables innovation rather than blocking it. And your customers, again, understand when you're looking at how you're using AI and you're clearly explaining it. It's all about clarity, really, Tiffany, when you think about it. It's going to allow you to move faster because everyone understands what the rules are. Again, I come from an environment where you have very clear rules of engagement. I mean, I was in the military before that. It's always about what are your rules of engagement, who owns what role, what is everyone doing, who's the decision maker ultimately. This helps build trust. If your organization is transparent, you have clear governance, and you operate in that way, it's going to come across.
Yeah. No, so what I hear you saying is being intentional. That's what saved you the time the second go around. I'm sure there were not second, but being intentional on what those guardrails are, what those controls are, is what empowered your employees and such, and really did bolster the trust. Back in the day, let's call it back in the day, we used to collect data because just in case we might need it, right, later on. And I think improving awareness, I think the change in how society operates right now, people are more leery on the just in case. But I also don't know that the average day consumer understands the depth and breadth of data that we have about them, about the businesses, things like that. So I do think that, being more intentional. Is there anything else that you could advise security leaders that might be listening in today on how to respond to all of the changes with privacy regulations, with evolving technologies, on how they can respond without slowing innovation?
Yeah, no, that's a great way to look at it because you can't look at it as an obstacle, really. If anything, if you want to think about what your innovation looks like, it can't be reckless either, right? So looking at things like privacy by design, it supports sustainable innovation. It helps build trust and compliance from the onset. If it's always I talked about it being an add-on as an afterthought. If you look at it from a privacy by design sort of perspective, it is already built in. It's part of your very genetics, it's part of your fabric. And again, that comes off as genuine because you aren't adding it because somebody else in your sector got hit and now you're like, oh, ooh, better respond to that. No, you are building it, you are leading from the front. So things like, and I again, you mentioned about people collecting data just in case. It's and again, you think of police data as a very sensitive focus. This is huge, where you are getting audited regularly. And I remember back in 20 years ago, even this was 25 years ago, I remember being assigned to do audits of why data was collected, because we had to answer to that. Why are you collecting this data? Why are you retaining this data? Is this data classified effectively? Have you flagged someone on a database? Maybe they were a suspect when you first went in, but then after you go to the call, you resolve it, the person is no longer a suspect. Did you change that classification? That may seem like such a small thing, but I can tell you it's a huge thing if someone applies for a job where they have to get a criminal record check or a vulnerable security check, working with children and vulnerable people, where that will all come out. So you don't see the impact of something that may have been done 20 years ago, but then again, you're still retaining the data. Why are you still retaining it? So, audit why data is collected, not just how it's used and where it's stored. Most importantly, again, we go back to, do your employees understand what you collect, why you collect it, or is it a case of, we've always just retained this, so we're just going to keep retaining it? Nobody really understands why they're doing it. And to me, this is a dangerous thing, even beyond data privacy. Your employees, behaving in a certain way or following certain protocols because that's how they've always done it and they don't know any other way. So you need to empower them to ask those questions, to say, okay, hold on a second, wait a minute, why are we collecting this? Because this kind of doesn't seem right. And equipping them with simple language. And this sounds like such a small thing, but it's really not. You're equipping your teams with simple language to help explain data value and use. So simple language is key, because especially when it's across, you talk about multiple teams, does this mean the same thing to that team as it means to this team? And if your role is so, sort of privacy, data privacy focused, that you understand the lingo and can speak it, but someone else may not understand it, and maybe they're too embarrassed to ask. So having those sort of consistent language, consistent rules, at the end of the day, treat it like you would want your data to be treated. Would you want your data to be sort of like willy-nilly, or someone's holding on to it for no reason? And if you wouldn't want that, then ensure that you sort of apply through that same lens for other people's data.
Yeah. And I know we're about at time, but I had a thought just now. You're talking about how important privacy is to the fabric of an organization, to their culture. And the example I gave was like, we've always done it this way. Well, AI is not the way we've always done it. Now it's the everybody's doing this. And so we should be able to do this as well. And so the privacy awareness that we're talking about this week during Data Privacy Week is more about the ongoing conversations, the ongoing integration into everything that we do, and how important that is, versus just that checkbox of we're talking about it during Data Privacy Week.
No, 100%. And what a great way to wrap up, Tiffany. I want to thank you for joining me on this great discussion. And thank you to everyone, all of you, for joining in joining us, at Optiv for today's LinkedIn Live conversation. You can connect with us at optiv.com to learn more about solutions to simplify cybersecurity. For more insights, subscribe to our LinkedIn newsletter. Thank you all, everyone. Thank you, Tiffany, for joining, and have a great rest of your day. Bye.